They said their blood was tainted with cowardice. They said their minds were too simple, too childlike, to comprehend the complex mechanics of a modern war machine. They said that a black man, by his very nature, lacked the reflexes, the judgment, and the courage to pilot a fighter plane in the crucible of combat. This wasn't just barroom chatter or the ravings of a backwoods demagogue. This was the official, educated, and scientifically backed opinion of the United States Army War College. In a now infamous 1925 study, the military had concluded, with the cold certainty of academic authority, that Negroes were mentally inferior, submissive by nature, and therefore fundamentally unfit for the demands of aviation. The sky, they had decided, was a whites-only domain. Yet, in the skies over a Europe torn apart by tyranny, a group of young black men would take these racist theories, douse them in aviation fuel, and set them on fire. They would paint the tails of their planes a defiant, blood red, a symbol that would become a beacon of hope for Allied bombers and a mark of fear for the elite pilots of the German Luftwaffe. They were told they were just an experiment. They became the Tuskegee Airmen. To understand the miracle of the red tails, you must first understand the mountain of institutional hatred they had to climb. America in the late 1930s and early 1940s was a nation gearing up to fight a global war for democracy, while simultaneously practicing a form of racial apartheid at home. The military was rigidly, almost proudly, segregated. Black men who rushed to enlist, eager to prove their patriotism, were overwhelmingly shunted into service roles. They were cooks, drivers, stevedores, and ditch diggers. The message from the War Department was brutally clear. We want your labor, not your leadership. Your sweat, not your valor. The most prestigious and technologically advanced branch of the military, the Army Air Corps, was the most exclusive club of all. It was a fraternity of white, often college-educated men, and the idea of allowing a black man into the cockpit of one of their prized fighter planes was, to most of them, unthinkable. It was a violation of the natural order of things. For years, black civil rights organizations, newspapers, and politicians had been waging a relentless campaign, demanding the right for black men to be trained as military pilots. They argued, with undeniable logic, that you could not ask a man to die for his country while denying him the right to fight for it in a meaningful way. The pressure mounted. With the world inching closer to war, the hypocrisy of America's position became too glaring to ignore. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a canny politician feeling the heat from black leaders in the press, finally authorized the creation of a program to train black pilots. But it was a concession born of political necessity, not a change of heart. The program was designed, in many ways, to fail. Instead of being integrated into the existing flight schools, the black cadets were sent to a newly constructed, completely segregated airfield in the heart of the Deep South, Tuskegee, Alabama. The location was a deliberate choice, a symbolic message. They would be trained in the shadow of one of the nation's most famous black educational institutions, Tuskegee Institute, founded by Booker T. Washington. But they would also be surrounded by the suffocating, hostile racism of rural Alabama, a place where a black man in a uniform was seen not as a hero, but as a threat. They were to be an experiment, isolated and contained. The program was called the Tuskegee Experiment. The name itself was an insult. You don't call the training of white pilots an experiment. The term implied that their success was a matter of scientific curiosity, not a foregone conclusion. The entire military establishment was watching, and most were waiting, even hoping, for them to fail. They were given second-hand planes, less experienced instructors, and a constant barrage of doubt from the white command structure. Cadets who washed out were often treated with a smug, "I told you so" attitude. The psychological pressure was immense. These young men knew They were not just flying for themselves. They were carrying the weight of 13 million Black Americans on their shoulders. Every flight, every test, every maneuver was a trial. If they failed, their failure would be used for decades as proof that the 1925 War College study had been right all along. The men who came to Tuskegee were the best and the brightest of their generation. They were college graduates, brilliant students from cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit, and determined young men from the small towns of the South. They had to be exceptional just to be considered. They had to pass the same rigorous physical and written exams as the white cadets, but they also had to possess an almost superhuman level of determination to navigate the maze of institutional racism that was designed to keep them out. Among them was a young man from Washington, D.C., Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. He was no stranger to the military's prejudice. He was the son of the highest-ranking black officer in the entire U.S. Army, a man who had endured a lifetime of segregation and disrespect. Davis Jr. himself was a graduate of West Point, the nation's most prestigious military academy, where for 4 years he had been subjected to the silent treatment. No white cadet would speak to him, room with him, or even acknowledge his existence. An organized campaign of psychological warfare designed to break him and force him to resign. He had not broken. He had endured, and he had graduated. Now, he had come to Tuskegee to lead this new generation of pioneers. He would become the first commander of the Tuskegee Airmen, his quiet, iron-willed discipline setting the tone for the entire program. The training was grueling, a relentless process of elimination. They learned to fly in the wobbly, unforgiving PT-17 Stearman biplanes, then graduated to more powerful fighters. They studied aerodynamics, navigation, and gunnery. They spent hours in the Alabama heat, practicing formations, dogfighting, and mastering the complex art of aerial combat. And all the while, they lived under the constant, demoralizing shadow of segregation. They were officers in the United States Army, but they couldn't enter a whites-only restaurant in the nearby town. They were learning to fly and fight for their country, but they were treated as second-class citizens on their own base. But out of this crucible of high standards and profound injustice, a powerful brotherhood was forged. They were united by a common dream and a common enemy. They pushed each other, supported each other, and held each other to an impossibly high standard. They knew they had no room for error. They had to be perfect. As they earned their wings, one by one, they were not just becoming pilots. They were becoming warriors, getting ready for a war on two fronts, one against the fascists in Europe, and another, more personal one, against the racism of their own country. The experiment was about to yield its results, and the world was not prepared for what was coming. After months of grueling training under the Alabama sun, the first graduates of the Tuskegee program were finally ready for war. In April of 1943, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the first all-black fighter squadron in American history, was deployed overseas. But their arrival in North Africa was not the glorious entry into combat they had dreamed of. It was the beginning of a new and deeply frustrating chapter in their struggle for respect. The deep-seated prejudice of the American military command had followed them across the Atlantic. Instead of being sent immediately to the front lines, they were largely relegated to backwater assignments, flying patrols over areas with little to no enemy activity. Worse still, they were equipped with second-rate aircraft. While white squadrons were being outfitted with the newer, more powerful P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, the 99th was given older, less capable P-40 Warhawks. It was a clear and deliberate message from the high command. They were not a priority. They were an experiment to be kept on the sidelines, out of the way of the real war. The men were seething with frustration. They had trained for years, honed their skills to a razor's edge, and now they were being treated like a ceremonial unit, a public relations stunt. The white commanders in the theater were deeply skeptical of their abilities. One of the most powerful and influential officers, Colonel William Momier, a man who would later become a four-star general, was a particularly vocal critic. He saw the Tuskegee Airmen not as an asset, but as a problem. He complained that they were inexperienced, that they lacked discipline in the air, and that they were not aggressive enough in combat. In a scathing report, he recommended that the 99th Squadron be removed from combat operations entirely and relegated to coastal patrols, effectively ending the Tuskegee Experiment as a failure. The report was a potential death blow. It was exactly the kind of proof that the segregationist elements in the military had been waiting for. The news sent a shockwave back to the United States. The fate of the entire program hung in the balance. But the Tuskegee Airmen had a powerful champion in their corner. Their commander, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. Davis, a man who had endured the silent treatment at West Point and had faced down prejudice his entire life, was not about to let his men be destroyed by racist innuendo. He flew to Washington, D.C. to testify before a War Department committee that was reviewing Momier's report. In a calm, measured, and devastatingly logical presentation, Davis systematically dismantled Momier's arguments. He pointed out that his squadron had been given outdated equipment and had been assigned to sectors with minimal enemy contact. How could they be expected to rack up a high number of kills when there were no enemy planes to shoot down? He presented data, flight logs, and mission reports that showed his pilots were, in fact, highly skilled and disciplined. He argued, with the quiet fury of a man who had been pushed too far, that his men were not being judged on their performance, but on the color of their skin. His testimony was so powerful, so undeniably factual, that the committee was swayed. The recommendation to disband the squadron was rejected. The Tuskegee Experiment would continue. And then, almost as if on cue, the men of the 99th provided their own, more dramatic rebuttal. In early 1944, while supporting the Allied invasion of Italy, they were on a patrol over the heavily defended Anzio beachhead. They encountered a squadron of elite German Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, some of the best and most feared planes in the Luftwaffe. The ensuing dogfight was a ferocious test. The Tuskegee pilots, in their supposedly inferior P-40s, dove into the fight with a controlled, lethal aggression. In a matter of minutes, they had shot down 12 German planes without losing a single one of their own. It was a stunning, lopsided victory that could not be ignored. The news of the Anzio Turkey shoot echoed through the Allied command. The pilots who had been dismissed as timid and inexperienced had just wiped the sky with some of Germany's best aces. The whispers and the doubts began to fade, replaced by a grudging, undeniable respect. The performance of the 99th not only saved the program, but it paved the way for the deployment of a larger, more powerful all-black unit, the 332nd Fighter Group, which would absorb the 99th Squadron and be composed entirely of Tuskegee graduates. And it was with the 332nd that the legend of the Red Tails was truly born. Now equipped with state-of-the-art P-51 Mustangs, the best all-around fighter plane of the war, the Tuskegee Airmen were finally given a mission that matched their skills: bomber escort. This was one of the most vital and dangerous jobs in the air war. The massive B-17 and B-24 bombers were slow, lumbering targets, vulnerable to attacks from swift German fighters. The job of the escort pilots was to stick close to the bombers, to fight off the swarms of enemy interceptors, and to get the big friends, as they called them, to their targets and back home safely. It was a sacred duty. The 332nd, now under the command of the newly promoted Colonel Davis, made a bold and symbolic choice: to distinguish their planes and to send a clear message to both friend and foe. They painted the tails of their Mustangs a bright, vibrant red. In the vast blue skies over Europe, these red tails became an unmistakable symbol. For the German pilots, they became a mark of danger, a sign that they were about to engage with a highly skilled and aggressive group of fighters. But for the white bomber crews, who were facing terrifyingly high casualty rates, the sight of those red-tailed angels on their wings became the most beautiful and welcome sight in the world. The bomber crews didn't care about the color of the pilot's skin. They cared about who could get them home alive, and a legend began to spread through the bomber bases in Italy. The pilots with the red tails were different. They were disciplined. They didn't go chasing after individual glory, trying to rack up kills by abandoning the bombers. They stuck to their mission. They stayed with the bombers, no matter what. Bomber crews, who had once been filled with the same casual racism as the rest of America, began to specifically request the red tails for their escorts. They knew that when the 332nd was on the job, their chances of survival went up dramatically. The experiment that had begun in the suffocating prejudice of Alabama was now yielding its undeniable, life-saving results in the deadly skies over the Third Reich. The legend of the Red Tail Angels was not a myth born of public relations. It was a reputation forged in the crucible of some of the most brutal aerial combat of World War II. From their bases in Italy, the Tuskegee Airmen of the 332nd Fighter Group were tasked with the longest and most dangerous escort missions of the war, flying deep into the heart of the Third Reich. They escorted heavy bombers on devastating raids against heavily defended targets in Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, targets that were protected by a swarm of the Luftwaffe's finest pilots and a curtain of deadly anti-aircraft fire, known as flak. Their primary mission, as drilled into them with an almost religious fervor by Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., was deceptively simple but incredibly difficult to execute. Protect the bombers at all costs. This was a direct counterpoint to the prevailing glory boy culture that existed in many American fighter groups. The path to fame and becoming an ace was to shoot down 5 or more enemy aircraft. This created a powerful incentive for fighter pilots to be aggressive, to break formation and chase after German fighters, sometimes leaving the slow, vulnerable bombers they were supposed to be protecting exposed. Colonel Davis understood this, and he made a strategic and deeply principled decision. The primary goal of the 332nd would not be to create individual aces. It would be to achieve a perfect escort record. He instilled in his men a fierce, almost fanatical discipline. Stick with the big friends, was the mantra. He forbade his pilots from pursuing German fighters if it meant abandoning the bomber formation. Their job was to be a shield, a wall of red-tailed protectors that the Luftwaffe would have to break through. It was a less glamorous, but far more vital role. It required a level of restraint and teamwork that was the ultimate test of a pilot's professionalism. The white bomber crews, who were facing terrifyingly high casualty rates in the early stages of the air war, quickly became true believers. They saw, mission after mission, that when the fighters with the distinctive red tails were on their wing, their chances of survival skyrocketed. A powerful, unspoken bond was formed at 25,000 feet, a brotherhood of the sky that transcended the deeply ingrained racial divides on the ground. Bomber pilots, after returning from a harrowing mission where they had been saved from certain death by the swift and aggressive red-tail escorts, would make a point of walking over to the 332nd's segregated side of the airfield to personally thank the pilots, men they might not have been allowed to share a table with back in the States. In the air, there was only one color that mattered, the friendly blue of an American plane. A legend began to spread through the bomber bases across Italy. The pilots with the red tails were different. They were disciplined. They didn't go chasing after individual glory. They stuck to their mission. They stayed with the bombers, no matter what. The requests started to come in. Bomber groups, whose crews had once been filled with the same casual racism as the rest of America, began to specifically request the red-tailed angels for their most dangerous escorts. They knew that when the 332nd was on the job, they had the best possible chance of coming home alive. The experiment that had begun in the suffocating prejudice of Alabama was now yielding its undeniable, life-saving results in the deadly skies over the Third Reich. The Tuskegee Airmen's overall combat record was extraordinary. Over the course of the war, they flew more than 15,000 individual sorties and completed over 1,500 missions for the 15th Air Force. They destroyed or damaged over 400 enemy aircraft, both in the air and on the ground. They shot up enemy trains, convoys, and industrial sites. In one incredible and audacious mission, a group of red tails strafed a German destroyer in the harbor of Trieste with their 50 caliber machine guns alone, causing so much damage that the ship eventually sank. It was a feat of marksmanship and daring that was almost unheard of. But their most celebrated and historically significant achievement remained their bomber escort record. In over 200 escort missions, the Tuskegee Airmen of the 332nd Fighter Group were credited for years with the unique distinction of never having lost a single bomber under their direct protection to an enemy fighter. While later, more detailed analysis of mission records has shown that a small number of bombers were in fact lost, around 27 in total, a number still far below the average of other escort groups, the legend itself speaks to a larger truth. Their loss rate was so incredibly low, so far superior to the average group's rate of 46 bombers lost, that for the men they were protecting, it felt like they were invincible. The legend was more powerful than the statistics. Their most famous and dramatic test came on March 24th, 1945. The 332nd was tasked with escorting a massive force of B-17 bombers on a grueling 1,600-mile round trip raid to the Daimler-Benz tank factory in Berlin. At this late stage of the war, Berlin was the most heavily defended city in the world, a hornet's nest of anti-aircraft guns and the very best, most desperate fighter pilots the Luftwaffe had left. It was a mission deep into the lion's den, a target that struck fear into the hearts of even the most veteran bomber crews. On that day, the Red Tails encountered something new and terrifying, the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. These German jets were a quantum leap in aviation technology, faster and more heavily armed than any Allied plane in the sky. They could tear through a bomber formation with a speed that was almost impossible to counter, firing powerful cannons that could shred a B-17s in seconds. As these futuristic jets screamed through the bomber formation, the Red Tails, in their propeller-driven Mustangs, did not hesitate. They dove into the fight against a technologically superior foe. In the ensuing historic dogfight, the first ever major engagement between American fighters and German jets, the Tuskegee Airmen proved that the quality of the pilot was more important than the speed of the plane. They used their superior tactical skills and maneuverability to get on the tails of the faster jets. In a stunning display of aerial gunnery, pilots Roscoe Brown, Earl Lane, and Charles Brantley each shot down one of the Me-262s. They had faced down the Luftwaffe's most advanced weapon and had won. On that same mission, they protected their bombers perfectly. They had flown to the heart of the Nazi Empire, defeated its most futuristic weapon, and had returned home as victors, once again, without losing a single big friend under their direct escort to enemy fighters. It was the crowning achievement of their combat career, a final, undeniable testament to their skill and their courage. But the heroism of the Tuskegee Airmen was not confined to the deadly skies over Europe. Even as they were compiling one of the most legendary combat records of the war, they were fighting a second, equally important battle on the ground. This was not a war fought with machine guns and cannons, but with courage, principle, and a profound understanding of civil disobedience. This was their war against the soul-crushing absurdity of American military segregation, and its defining battle took place not in Germany, but in the heart of America itself, at a place called Freeman Field, Indiana. By 1945, the Tuskegee program had expanded. The initial success of the fighter pilots had led to the creation of a new, all-black unit, the 477th Bombardment Group, which was being trained to fly the B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. This group brought together a large contingent of Tuskegee-trained officers, pilots, navigators, and bombardiers, many of them already combat veterans from the European theater. They were the elite, the proven best of the Tuskegee Experiment. And in the spring of 1945, they were transferred to Freeman Field for the final stages of their training before an anticipated deployment to the Pacific. Freeman Field, however, was commanded by Colonel Robert Selway, a man who was a product of the old, rigidly segregationist army. He was deeply uncomfortable with the presence of so many confident, accomplished black officers on his base. He was determined to enforce the color line, to remind these heroes that despite their rank and their accomplishments, they were still subject to the humiliating rules of Jim Crow. Selway's method was a cynical and legally dubious form of institutional racism. He knew that outright segregation of officers was technically against Army regulations. So he devised a plan. He designated two separate officers' clubs on the base. One, the well-appointed main club, was designated for the use of supervisors. The other, a dilapidated, run-down shack mockingly nicknamed Uncle Tom's Cabin, was designated for trainees. The trick was transparent and insulting. All of the supervisors on the base were white. All of the black officers, regardless of their rank, their combat experience, or their status as instructors, were classified as trainees. It was segregation by another name, a blatant and demeaning attempt to create a whites-only club. The black officers, men who had just returned from risking their lives fighting a war against a racist, totalitarian regime, were outraged. They had earned their commissions. They were officers in the United States Army, and they were being told they weren't good enough to enter the same club as their white counterparts. They decided to fight back. This was not a spontaneous act of anger. It was a carefully planned, disciplined campaign of nonviolent resistance. Led by a core group of veterans, they decided to challenge the illegal order directly. On the night of April 5th, 1945, a group of 19 black officers, in full dress uniform, walked in small groups to the main supervisors club and politely attempted to enter. They were denied entry. They were arrested by the base provost marshal. The next night, another, larger group of officers did the same thing. They too were arrested. The protest had begun. The standoff escalated. Colonel Selway, furious at this challenge to his authority, demanded that every black officer on the base sign a document, a new regulation he had drafted, that would officially classify them as trainees and order them to use only the designated trainee facilities. It was a loyalty test, a demand that they formally consent to their own segregation. The officers, understanding that this was the crucial moment, refused. In an incredible act of collective defiance, 101 black officers refused to sign the order. Selway's response was swift and draconian. He had all 101 officers arrested and charged them with the most serious crime a soldier can face in wartime: mutiny, specifically for disobeying the direct order of a superior officer, a crime punishable by death. The Freeman Field Mutiny was now a full-blown crisis. These men were not rioting. They were not violent. They were simply and courageously insisting on their rights as American officers. They were risking their careers, their freedom, and even their lives to demand the simple dignity of being treated as men. The incident became a national scandal. The black press, which had been following the Tuskegee Airmen story for years, erupted in outrage. Civil rights organizations mobilized. Letters and telegrams flooded the War Department, demanding justice for the arrested officers. The pressure became so intense that the Army High Command in Washington was forced to intervene. General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, ordered the release of most of the officers, though the letters of reprimand remained in their files. 3 of the officers, however, were singled out for a full court-martial. The legal battle that followed was a landmark moment. Thurgood Marshall, the brilliant young lawyer for the NAACP, who would one day become a Supreme Court justice, was involved in the defense. The trial exposed the absurdity and the illegality of Selway's segregationist policies. In the end, the main charges were dropped. The Freeman Field Mutiny was a stunning victory, not just for the men involved, but for the entire cause of desegregation. It was a courageous stand that, along with their stellar combat record in Europe, became another powerful and undeniable argument for the complete integration of the U.S. military. Just 3 years later, in 1948, President Harry S. Truman would sign Executive Order 9981, officially ending segregation in the armed forces. The line from the skies over Berlin to the defiance stand at Freeman Field to the signing of that historic order is direct and unbroken. The Tuskegee Airmen had fought and won their war on both fronts. When the war in Europe finally ended in May of 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen had more than just proven their case. They had obliterated every racist argument that had been leveled against them. They had answered the skepticism with skill, the doubt with discipline, and the hatred with heroism. They had earned the respect of their white comrades in the air and had cemented a combat record that was, by any measure, extraordinary. They had flown to the heart of the Nazi Empire, faced down its most advanced weapons, and had come home as victors. They were returning to America not as an experiment, but as heroes. Men who had fought and bled for the very freedoms their country proclaimed to the world. But the America they returned to was not the grateful, transformed nation they had hoped for. It was the same America they had left, a country still deeply scarred by the hypocrisy of fighting for democracy abroad while denying it to its own citizens at home. For the Tuskegee Airmen, the victory parade was short, and the peace that followed was long and bitter. They came home to a nation that was eager to celebrate the end of the war, but was just as eager to put them back in their place. The stories of their return are a heartbreaking litany of injustice. Airmen who had been celebrated as liberators in Europe came home to find they still couldn't sit at a lunch counter in their own hometowns. Pilots who had commanded $100,000 fighter planes and dueled with the best of the Luftwaffe came home and couldn't find a job as a commercial airline pilot because of the color of their skin. Not a single one of the original Tuskegee Airmen was hired by a commercial airline in the post-war era. The very industry they had helped to protect, the skies they had mastered, remained a whites-only club. The military, which had been forced by the necessities of war to give them a chance, quickly tried to forget the lessons it had learned. The stellar combat record of the 332nd Fighter Group was downplayed, its achievements often attributed to other units, or simply omitted from official histories. The narrative of the air war was rewritten to star the White Aces, while the Red Tail Angels, who had so masterfully protected the bombers, were rendered as footnotes if they were mentioned at all. The institution was resistant to change. It had been proven, beyond any doubt, that black men could fly and fight with the best of them. But the system of segregation was so deeply entrenched that the truth was simply ignored. The Freeman Field Mutiny, that courageous act of nonviolent resistance against segregation within the Army, was not celebrated as a stand for justice. It was buried. The officers involved had letters of reprimand placed in their official files, a black mark that would follow them for the rest of their military careers, denying them promotions and opportunities. It would take 50 years, until 1995, for those letters to be officially removed and for the actions of the mutineers to be vindicated. But the Tuskegee Airmen had been changed by their experience. They were not the same men who had entered the program a few years earlier. They had seen the world. They had been treated as equals by the Europeans they had liberated. They had proven their own worth in the most demanding crucible imaginable, and they were not willing to go back to the quiet submission of the pre-war era. They returned to their communities, not as broken men, but as leaders. They used their GI Bill benefits, when they were not denied them by racist administrators, to get college degrees. They became doctors, lawyers, teachers, and politicians. They brought the same discipline, the same commitment to excellence, and the same quiet, unshakable dignity from the cockpit to the courtroom, the classroom, and the halls of government. They became the backbone of the generation that would dismantle the system of Jim Crow. The post-war years were a long, cold winter for the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen. While the nation celebrated a new era of peace and prosperity, the heroes of the 332nd Fighter Group found themselves fighting a new and lonely war, a war against forgetting. The same country that had reluctantly allowed them to fight was now making a concerted effort to erase their contributions from the national memory. It was a quiet, insidious form of violence, an attempt to rob them not of their lives, but of their history, their truth. The military was the primary architect of this erasure. Official histories of the air war in Europe were written with a conspicuous and deliberate blind spot. The legendary bomber escort record of the Red Tails was not celebrated. It was buried in classified reports or simply ignored. In the narrative that was being constructed, the skies over Germany had been won by brave white pilots. The contributions of the nearly 1,000 black men who had flown and fought with such distinction were treated as a minor, almost embarrassing footnote. This wasn't just an oversight, it was a policy. To acknowledge the superiority of a black fighter group in the most critical mission of the air war, bomber escort, would be to shatter the very foundation of the military's segregationist ideology. And the institution was not ready for that kind of earthquake. This official silence had a profound ripple effect. Hollywood, in its golden age of post-war cinema, produced a flood of heroic war films. Movies like 12 O'Clock High celebrated the courage of the bomber crews and the dashing heroism of their fighter escorts. But in this cinematic universe, the Red Tail Angels did not exist. The pilots on screen were invariably white. For a generation of Americans who learned their history from the movie theater, the Tuskegee Airmen were rendered invisible, their story untold, their sacrifice unknown. Textbooks followed suit, reducing their entire groundbreaking experience to a single, sanitized paragraph, if they were mentioned at all. But the Tuskegee Airmen themselves refused to be erased. They had been forged into a brotherhood in the crucible of Tuskegee and the skies over Europe, and that bond was unbreakable. They understood that if their story was going to be preserved, they would have to be the ones to preserve it. In 1972, they formally incorporated Tuskegee Airmen Inc., a national organization dedicated to honoring the accomplishments of their members and to inspiring future generations. This was a crucial, strategic move. It was the formal continuation of the war for their legacy. The organization became a living archive. They held conventions, bringing the aging veterans together to share their stories and reconnect. They painstakingly collected documents, photographs, flight logs, and personal letters, building a repository of evidence that would one day become the undeniable foundation for their historical resurrection. They created a speakers bureau, sending airmen to schools, churches, and community events across the country to tell their story to anyone who would listen. It was often a frustrating and thankless task. For years, they were voices crying in the wilderness. The mainstream media was largely uninterested. The historical establishment was slow to acknowledge them, but they were persistent. They knew the power and the importance of their own truth. A Tuskegee Airman speaking to a classroom of young children was a powerful force. Here was a living hero, a man who had faced down prejudice and enemy fighters, a quiet, dignified man in a blazer, often wearing a distinctive red jacket, who could speak with absolute authority about courage, discipline, and the pursuit of excellence against all odds. They were planting seeds, ensuring that their story would not die with their generation. They also became powerful advocates for change within the military and the aviation industry. They mentored young black men and women who dreamed of becoming pilots, guiding them and helping them to navigate the still-present challenges of a predominantly white field. They pushed for greater representation in the Air Force Academy and in the boardrooms of commercial airlines. They were not just preserving their past, they were actively shaping the future. The slow, patient, and persistent war against forgetting, waged for decades by the Tuskegee Airmen themselves, finally began to bear fruit in the closing years of the 20th century. The seeds they had planted in classrooms and communities for so long began to sprout. A new generation of historians, journalists, and filmmakers, a generation that had been shaped by the profound social changes of the civil rights movement, began to rediscover their story. They saw it not as a minor footnote, but for what it truly was, a powerful, dramatic, and quintessentially American saga of triumph over unimaginable adversity. The tide was beginning to turn. The trickle of recognition became a steady stream, and then a flood. Academic articles were published, meticulously documenting their combat record and debunking the old racist myths. Local news stories about the aging heroes living in quiet neighborhoods began to get national attention. Documentaries were produced, bringing the grainy, black and white images of the Red Tails to life for a new audience. But the cultural watershed moment, the event that would transform the Tuskegee Airmen from a piece of historical trivia into household names, came in 1995. HBO, the premium cable network, released a feature film titled simply The Tuskegee Airmen, starring a cast of prominent black actors led by Lawrence Fishburne and Cuba Gooding Jr. The film was a high-budget, high-profile production that told their story with the epic sweep and emotional power it deserved. It was a critical and popular sensation. For the first time, a massive, mainstream American audience was introduced to the story of the Tuskegee Experiment, the bigotry they faced, their struggles for respect, and their ultimate, undeniable glory in the skies over Europe. The film was a cultural earthquake. It transformed the Tuskegee Airmen from a forgotten chapter of history into a central part of the American narrative of World War II. Suddenly, the men who had been living in quiet obscurity for 50 years were in demand. They were no longer just speaking to small school groups. They were being invited to the White House. They were being honored at Air Force ceremonies. They were being sought out for interviews by the very same national media that had ignored them for decades. For the surviving airmen, now in their 70s and 80s, it was a long overdue and often overwhelming vindication. The world was finally, at long last, listening. This new wave of national recognition also brought with it a renewed push for official justice. The case of the Freeman Field Mutiny was re-examined. The actions of the more than 100 black officers who had been arrested for peacefully protesting illegal segregation were no longer seen as insubordination, but as a courageous and principled stand for civil rights. In 1995, the Air Force officially cleared the records of all the officers involved, removing the letters of reprimand that had stained their careers for half a century. It was a formal admission that the men had been right, and the system had been wrong. This crescendo of recognition culminated in the ultimate official honor. On March 29, 2007, in a deeply emotional and historic ceremony held in the Grand Rotunda of the U.S. Capitol, the Tuskegee Airmen were collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor that the United States Congress can bestow. It is an honor reserved for figures of monumental national significance. Over 300 of the surviving airmen were present, old men now, many in wheelchairs, their bodies frail, but their spirits as strong as ever. Dressed in their distinctive red blazers, they were a living sea of honor. President George W. Bush, in a moment of profound historical significance, stood before these heroes, raised his hand in a crisp military salute, and spoke the words the nation should have said 60 years earlier. "I would like to offer a salute to you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "to help atone for all the unreturned salutes and unforgivable indignities." It was a moment of national catharsis, an apology, and a celebration all in one. The President of the United States was saluting the men whom the U.S. Army had once deemed unfit even to fly. The symbolism was staggering. The experiment that had been born of prejudice and designed to fail had ended in the hallowed halls of the nation's capital, with the highest honor the country could give. The quiet, persistent war against forgetting had, in the end, been won. So, what is the final, enduring legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen? What is the ultimate lesson to be drawn from their long and arduous journey from the segregated fields of Alabama to the hallowed halls of the U.S. Capitol? Their story is far more than just a thrilling chapter in military history. It is a profound and timeless testament to the power of courage, the necessity of perseverance, and the quiet, unshakable dignity of excellence in the face of systemic injustice. They were more than just a group of pilots. They were pioneers who shattered one of the most deeply entrenched and insidious racist myths in American history. They were warriors who fought a war on two fronts and achieved victory on both. And they were leaders who returned home to become the vanguard of the civil rights movement, the very generation that would go on to dismantle the legal foundations of segregation. Their first and most visible legacy is the direct refutation of a lie. The 1925 Army War College study was not just a flawed report, it was a pillar of the entire ideology of white supremacy. It was scientific proof used to justify the exclusion of Black Americans from positions of authority and responsibility. The Tuskegee Airmen did not just argue against this lie. They systematically, meticulously, and courageously demolished it with an undeniable record of performance. Their legendary achievement of never losing a bomber to enemy fighters was not a matter of opinion. It was a statistical fact, a number that could not be twisted or explained away by prejudice. They proved that skill, courage, and discipline are not the property of any one race. They are the property of those who are willing to earn them. In doing so, they kicked out the intellectual and pseudo-scientific props that held up the entire rotten structure of military segregation. Their success was a catalyst, a key piece of evidence that would lead President Harry S. Truman to issue Executive Order 9981 in 1948, officially desegregating the United States Armed Forces. This was their most direct and tangible victory in the war at home. But their legacy goes far deeper than a change in policy. It is a profound lesson in how to fight and win a war on two fronts. Every single day of their service, they faced a dual threat. In the skies, they faced the deadly skill of the Luftwaffe. On the ground, they faced the soul-crushing weight of their own country's racism. They could have been broken by this. They could have become consumed by a righteous and understandable bitterness. They could have performed their duties with a cynical, half-hearted effort, saying, "Why should we risk our lives for a country that treats us this way?" Instead, they made a conscious, strategic choice. They chose to be perfect. They chose to answer the hatred with an unwavering commitment to excellence. Their motto was not just a slogan, it was a strategy. Fly to fight, yes, but also to prove. This is a powerful and sophisticated form of resistance. It is a form of protest that cannot be easily dismissed or silenced. By being the best, by holding themselves to a higher standard, they made the prejudice of their detractors look not just hateful, but foolish. They won the argument not by shouting, but by achieving. This quiet, dignified excellence became a more powerful weapon against racism than any bomb or bullet. It is a lesson that has been carried forward by generations of Black Americans in every field of endeavor. The understanding that in a system stacked against you, you often have to be twice as good to get half as much, and that the ultimate refutation of prejudice is undeniable success. Finally, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen is a testament to the power of brotherhood and collective identity. The Tuskegee Experiment was designed to isolate them, to contain them, but in that very isolation, they forged an unbreakable bond. They were not just a collection of individual pilots, they were the Lonely Eagles, a fraternity united by a common purpose, a shared struggle, and an immense sense of collective pride. They supported each other, pushed each other, and held each other accountable. This sense of brotherhood was their psychological armor against the daily onslaught of racism. And it was this same sense of brotherhood that allowed them to preserve their own history, to keep their own story alive through the long, cold decades of national amnesia, until the world was finally ready to listen. They said a black man couldn't fly a modern combat aircraft. They responded by mastering the P-51 Mustang and defeating the world's first jet fighters. They said they lacked discipline. They responded by compiling the most legendary bomber escort record of the entire war, a record that stands to this day. They said they were just an experiment. They became a legend. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It is a complex, often painful, and ultimately inspiring story about what it means to be a patriot in a nation that does not always love you back. It is a story that reminds us that true greatness is not about the absence of adversity, but about how one rises to meet it. Their red tails may have faded from the skies over Europe, but the fire they lit, the fire of courage, of excellence, of unbreakable dignity, continues to burn brightly. A permanent and powerful beacon in the long, ongoing struggle for a more perfect, more just, and more truly united United States of America.